This land we call Canada has a long story. It's a story that is rich, complex, and deeply rooted in the natural world. The vast landscapes from the towering Rocky Mountains to the expansive prairies and the dense forests have all been witnesses to the unfolding of this narrative. It's a story that starts long before the arrival of Europeans. The ancient petroglyphs and archaeological artifacts scattered across the land tell tales of a time when indigenous cultures flourished, developing intricate societies and rich traditions. Indigenous peoples were here first. They were the original inhabitants, the first to call this land home. Their presence is etched into the very fabric of the land, in the mountains, rivers, and forests that they revered and respected. Their history stretches back thousands of years, from the ancient settlements that dotted the landscape to the sophisticated trade networks that span the continent. Indigenous peoples have a history that is both deep and enduring. They lived and thrived in this land. Their way of life was in harmony with nature, guided by a profound understanding of the environment and a deep respect for all living things. They hunted, fished, and gathered, always mindful of the delicate balance of the ecosystem. They were the caretakers of the land and water. Their knowledge of the natural world was unparalleled, and they practiced sustainable living long before it became a modern concept. They understood that the health of the land and water was directly linked to their own well-being. The arrival of Europeans changed everything. It marked the beginning of a new era, one that brought profound and often devastating changes to indigenous communities. The newcomers brought with them new technologies, new ways of life, and new diseases, which had a dramatic impact on the indigenous populations. It marked a new chapter in the story of this land. The European colonization of Canada reshaped the landscape, both physically and culturally. The maps were redrawn, and the land was divided and claimed in ways that often disregarded the existing indigenous territories and ways of life. But it's important to remember that the first chapter belongs to the indigenous peoples. Their stories, traditions, and histories are the foundation upon which the modern nation of Canada is built. The wisdom of the elders and the resilience of the communities continue to inspire and guide us. Their history and culture are deeply woven into the fabric of Canada. Today, Indigenous cultures are celebrated and recognized for their contributions to the nation's identity. From art and music to language and spirituality, the influence of Indigenous peoples is evident in every aspect of Canadian life. Their legacy is a testament to their enduring spirit and their vital role in the ongoing story of this land. In Canada, we often use the term Indigenous to talk about all the original inhabitants of this land. But it's important to remember that this word encompasses many different groups. Three distinct groups are First Nations, Inuit, and Métis.
First Nations people lived across what is now Canada for generations before European contact. The Inuit people made their home in the Arctic regions. The Métis people emerged from the blending of First Nations and European cultures. Each group has its own unique history, language, and traditions.
The first people to call this land home were resourceful and resilient. They adapted to diverse environments. From coast to coast to coast, they thrived. They hunted, fished, and gathered. They built homes that suited their surroundings.
The First Nations people moved across the land following the animals they hunted. They developed complex social structures and governance systems. Their lives were deeply intertwined with the natural world. Stories, songs, and dances were used to pass down knowledge and traditions from one generation to the next.
The arrival of Europeans in the 15th century brought about significant changes. These changes were not just limited to the landscape, but also deeply affected the lives of the Indigenous peoples who had lived on this land for thousands of years. The Europeans came with their own customs, beliefs, and ways of life, which were often in stark contrast to those of the indigenous community. This period marked the beginning of a complex and often tumultuous relationship between the two groups. It marked the beginning of a new era, an era characterized by exploration, conquest, and the relentless pursuit of wealth and resources. The Europeans were driven by a desire to expand their territories and increase their influence. They were also motivated by the promise of untold riches, from gold and silver to the abundant natural resources that the New World had to offer. Europeans were drawn to the resources of this land. The vast forests, teeming rivers, and fertile soil promised a wealth of opportunities. They saw the potential for establishing new settlements, creating trade routes, and exploiting the natural bounty of the land. This drive for resources led to the establishment of numerous colonies and trading posts across North America. They sought furs, fish, and timber. These commodities were highly valued in Europe and could fetch high prices in the markets. The fur trade in particular became a major economic activity, with European traders establishing relationships with indigenous trappers and hunters. The fishing industry also flourished, with European fishermen exploiting the rich fishing grounds off the coast of North America. This led to trade between the newcomers and the indigenous peoples. The indigenous communities were skilled traders and had a deep understanding of the land and its resources. They traded furs, food, and other goods with the Europeans in exchange for metal tools, weapons, and other items that were new to them. This exchange of goods also led to an exchange of ideas and knowledge, although it was not always an equal or fair relationship.
But this contact also had devastating consequences. The arrival of Europeans brought about significant disruptions to the indigenous way of life. The newcomers often encroached on indigenous lands, leading to conflicts and displacement. The introduction of European goods and technologies also had a profound impact on indigenous cultures and economies. Europeans brought with them diseases like smallpox. These diseases were unknown to the indigenous peoples and spread rapidly through their communities. Smallpox, in particular, was highly contagious and deadly, causing widespread suffering and death. The indigenous populations had no natural immunity to these new illnesses, making them particularly vulnerable. Indigenous peoples had no immunity to these new illnesses. The impact was devastating, with entire communities being wiped out by disease. The loss of life was immense, and the social and cultural fabric of many indigenous societies was irreparably damaged. The spread of disease was one of the most tragic and far-reaching consequences of European contact. This led to widespread epidemics that decimated indigenous populations. The scale of the epidemics was unprecedented, with some estimates suggesting that up to 90% of the indigenous population in some areas was wiped out. The loss of so many lives had a profound impact on the survivors, who had to cope with the loss of loved ones, the breakdown of their communities, and the challenges of rebuilding their lives in the aftermath of such devastation. The impact of these diseases continues to affect indigenous communities today. Despite the passage of centuries, the legacy of these early epidemics is still felt. Many indigenous communities continue to struggle with health disparities and other challenges that can be traced back to this period of contact. However, there is also a story of resilience and recovery, as indigenous peoples work to preserve their cultures, rebuild their communities, and ensure a better future for the generations to come.
Section 5. Promises written on the wind treaties. As more Europeans arrived, they wanted more land. They signed agreements with indigenous peoples for access to the land and its resources. These agreements are known as treaties.
They were negotiated in the spirit of sharing and peace. However, the promises made in these treaties were often broken. The Canadian government did not always honor its commitments to the indigenous peoples. This led to disputes over land rights and resources. Many of these disputes continue to this day.
Section 6. The Dark Legacy, Residential Schools. One of the darkest chapters in Canadian history is the legacy of residential schools. These institutions were established in the late 19th century and operated for over 100 years, with their last one closing its doors in 1996. The primary objective of these schools was to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture, a goal that was pursued through harsh and often inhumane methods. For over a century, Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and communities. This separation was not just a physical one, but also an emotional and cultural disconnection. Children as young as 5 years old were taken away, often without the consent of their parents, and transported to distant schools where they would spend most of their childhood. They were sent to government-funded, church-run schools. These institutions were often located far from the children's home communities, making it difficult for families to visit or maintain any form of contact. The schools were run by various Christian denominations, including the Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches.
The goal of these schools was to assimilate Indigenous children into Canadian society. This was done by stripping away their Indigenous identities and replacing them with Euro-Canadian values and norms. The children were given new names, often English or French, and were required to wear uniforms that erased any trace of their cultural heritage. They were forbidden from speaking their languages and practicing their cultures. Any attempt to do so was met with severe punishment. The curriculum was designed to teach them basic literacy and numeracy, but also to instill a sense of inferiority about their own cultures and histories. The children were taught that their traditional ways of life were primitive and inferior to those of the Euro-Canadians. Many children suffered physical, emotional, and sexual abuse in these schools. The harsh discipline and overcrowded conditions created an environment where abuse was rampant. Many survivors have recounted stories of being beaten for speaking their native languages, being forced to do hard labor, and suffering from malnutrition and neglect. The emotional and psychological scars left by these experiences have had long-lasting effects on the survivors and their families. The trauma of residential schools continues to impact Indigenous communities today. The intergenerational trauma has manifested in various forms, including mental health issues, substance abuse, and a loss of cultural identity. Efforts are being made to heal and reconcile, but the road to recovery is long and complex. Indigenous communities are working tirelessly to reclaim their languages, traditions, and histories, and to ensure that the legacy of residential schools is never forgotten.
Section 7. Rising from the Ashes, Resilience and Resistance. Despite the many challenges they faced, Indigenous peoples never gave up hope. They fought to preserve their languages, cultures, and traditions. They resisted assimilation and fought for their rights.
Indigenous peoples have shown incredible resilience in the face of adversity. They have organized politically and legally to assert their rights. They have demanded that their voices be heard. Their resistance has led to important changes in Canadian society.
Section 8. Indigenous Voices, Modern Expressions. Today, there is a growing recognition of the importance of Indigenous voices and perspectives.
Indigenous artists, writers, musicians, and activists are sharing their stories and experiences with the world. From music to film, from literature to fashion, Indigenous artists are making their mark.
They are challenging stereotypes and sharing their unique perspectives. They are contributing to a richer and more inclusive Canadian culture. Section 9. Honoring Treaties, Pursuing Rights. Canada is at a crossroads in its relationship with Indigenous peoples. The country is grappling with its colonial past and its ongoing legacy.
There is a growing movement towards reconciliation. Reconciliation requires acknowledging past wrongs and working towards a more just and equitable future.
It means honoring treaty rights, addressing land claims, and supporting the self-determination of Indigenous peoples. Section 10. Walking Together. Reconciliation. Reconciliation is not just the responsibility of the government. It is a journey that we must all take together.
It requires listening to and learning from Indigenous peoples. It means challenging our own biases and assumptions.
Education is key to reconciliation. By learning about the history and culture of Indigenous peoples, we can begin to understand the impacts of colonization. We can start to build bridges of understanding and respect. Section 11. A shared future, learning and understanding. The story of Canada is a shared story. It is a story of Indigenous peoples and newcomers. It is a story of resilience, resistance, and hope.
By acknowledging the past and working together, we can create a better future for all. Let us move forward with respect and understanding.
Let us honor the treaties and work towards reconciliation. Let us build a Canada where all people can thrive.